Ever wonder, like when you're chatting with a chatbot, if it's treating you differently based on, your name?
Yeah.
Like maybe it seems a little creepy how much it seems to know about you.
Right, right.
Well, get this. There's this brand new research paper. It's called First Person Fairness in Chatbots.
Okay.
And it dives headfirst into that, like all those questions.
Interesting.
We're talking cutting edge research, fresh off the press.
Oh.
And lucky for you, we're here to unpack it all.
Yeah, this paper, it tackles a really important aspect of AI fairness, um, one that often gets overlooked.
Okay.
It's called first-person fairness.
First Person Fairness. Okay.
And it's all about how the AI treats you directly, like in the conversation.
Not just like making a decision about you, like with a loan application or something.
Exactly. This is about your experience.
Okay.
Like actually interacting with the chatbot itself.
Got it. Got it.
Think about it. You might use a chatbot for really personal things.
Yeah.
Like getting help writing your resume or something like that.
Sure.
And if there's bias baked in, well, then it's directly impacting you, not someone else.
Right, right. That makes sense. Okay, so how do they even like figure this out? How do you measure like bias in a chatbot?
So they used names
Okay.
as stand-ins for different demographics,
Okay.
gender, race, things like that.
Got it.
By feeding the chatbot the same prompts,
Uh-huh.
but just changing the user's name,
Yeah.
they could look for patterns.
Ah, so it's like that classic resume study,
Yes.
where they sent out the identical resumes?
Yeah.
But some had more, I don't know, like white-sounding names,
Exactly.
and others had, more black-sounding names.
It's a well-established method in social science.
Yeah.
And here's the kicker. This study didn't just look at a few dozen chats. They analyzed millions.
Wow.
That's a massive amount of data.
Yeah.
Enough to spot those subtle biases you might miss otherwise.
Okay, so I have to ask, like, were the chatbots completely biased? What did they find?
So the first finding was actually pretty surprising.
Okay.
They didn't find huge differences in the overall quality of the responses
Interesting.
based on gender or race, at least not in the ways that they measured quality.
So no blatant, this chatbot is better for men kind of thing?
Right.
That's good, right?
It's good, but there's a catch.
Okay.
They were mainly looking at things like accuracy
Okay.
and clarity.
Got it.
Subtle biases in, let's say, writing style.
Yeah.
The kind that might make you feel like you're talking to someone different.
Right.
Those were harder to capture.
Okay.
So it's not like chatbots are off the hook. It's just that the bias, if it's there, might be sneakier.
Okay. So that's surprising finding number one. What about number two? Like, where does this bias actually show up?
Here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
They found the most significant differences when they asked the chatbot to write me a story.
Wait, really? Stories?
Yeah.
Why stories of all things?
It's fascinating, though. They actually used another AI. It's like a language model research assistant.
Okay.
Let's just call it an LMRA
Okay, an LMRA. Got it.
to help analyze the stories.
Okay.
And the LMRA found that the chatbot was more likely to create a protagonist with the same gender as the user's name.
Whoa. So if I ask for a story and the chatbot thinks I'm a woman,
Right.
it'll probably write a story about a woman.
That seems to be the trend, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the chatbot is subconsciously projecting gender stereotypes onto the characters,
Wow.
even though it's just making stuff up.
Okay, that's kind of creepy. It's like those subtle biases we see everywhere else are finding their way into AI,
Right.
even in something as like simple as a fictional story. And what's even more unsettling is they found other what they called axes of difference in the chatbot's responses.
Yes. And this gets to those more nuanced forms of bias.
Okay.
They're not necessarily harmful stereotypes,
Right.
but definite patterns that make you wonder.
Give me an example. Like, what kind of axes of difference are we talking?
Well, one that jumped out was related to language complexity.
Okay.
The LMRA picked up on a tendency for the chatbot to use simpler language when responding to female-sounding names
Interesting.
compared to male-sounding names.
Hold on. Even when the chatbot isn't overtly biased in terms of what it's saying, it's still adjusting how it's saying it
Yeah,
based on perceived gender.
it appears so. It really makes you think, is the chatbot subconsciously associating simpler language with women?
Wow.
Or is it trying to be more accommodating based on some preconceived notion of how women communicate?
Right.
It's hard to say for sure.
It's like AI is mirroring those subtle biases we see in society, even if it's not explicitly programmed to do so.
Yeah.
Did the research uncover any other examples of these axes of difference? aside from the language complexity
They
issue?
found quite a few, actually. Remember how we were talking about the write me a story task?
Yeah.
And how the gender of the protagonist often matched the user's name?
Yeah, it was like the chatbot was casting the story based on a name.
Right. Well, they also found differences in the tone and style of the stories,
Interesting.
depending on whether the name sounded more masculine or feminine.
Okay.
For instance, the LMRA noted that stories written for female-sounding names tended to be more whimsical
Hmm.
and emphasized the character's emotions. In contrast, stories for male-sounding names were often described as darker or more dramatic.
So even in fictional storytelling, AI seems to fall back on these gendered tropes that are pervasive in our society.
It certainly seems that way. And
Yeah.
again, it's not necessarily that these responses were offensive or inappropriate in any way,
Right.
but those subtle differences can create a very different user experience,
Right.
depending on your gender.
It makes you wonder what other subtle biases might be lurking beneath the surface of those seemingly innocent chatbot responses. Like, are there differences in how a chatbot might give advice or explain complex topics based solely on your name? It's almost as if we need a whole new set of ethical guidelines for AI guidelines that address those everyday interactions with these systems.
I agree. And the researchers acknowledged that even their sophisticated tools like that LMRA weren't foolproof. For example, the LMRA excelled at spotting gender bias,
Okay.
but it struggled when it came to identifying potential racial bias.
So even the AI designed to detect bias has its own biases.
It's true.
That's a both reassuring and a bit unnerving, wouldn't you say? It really makes you think, huh. Like, on the one hand, it's reassuring that they're finding ways to make AI less biased.
Right.
But then you hear about the AI struggling with racial bias, and it's like, are we back at square one?
It really highlights how complex this issue is.
Yeah.
Think about it. Like, if even the AI designed to spot bias has limitations,
Right.
it begs the question, how do we move forward responsibly with this?
Exactly. So where do we go from here? What does all of this mean, like, for the future of chatbots and AI in general, especially with how integrated it's all becoming in our lives?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is the need for constant vigilance.
Okay.
Just because a chatbot seems, helpful and friendly
Right.
doesn't mean it's immune to these subtle biases.
Right.
And those biases, they can have a real impact
Mhm.
on our experiences and perceptions.
It's almost like we can't just focus on making AI more intelligent. We also need to prioritize making it fair, equitable.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just build impressive technology.
Right.
We need to make sure it reflects the kind of world we actually want to live in,
Right.
a world that's inclusive and equitable for everyone.
It's a lot to consider. We've talked about first-person fairness, the surprising ways bias can pop up in chatbots, even the limitations of the tools that are designed to detect bias. What what stands out most to you from all this research?
The thing that really struck me was how even seemingly harmless tasks, like, the write me a story,
Yeah.
can reveal these subtle biases in AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really underscores how important it is to consider bias at every stage of development with AI,
Totally.
not just those high-stakes applications.
It's true. And while the challenges are, I mean, they're daunting, it is encouraging to know that they are developing these techniques like reinforcement learning that can help kind of mitigate some of that. So, there is hope that we can at least try to guide these technologies in a more ethical direction.
Definitely. But we need to remember, technology, AI included, it's essentially a tool.
Right.
And just like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. The responsibility ultimately lies with us, with how we choose to develop and utilize these technologies.
So it's not just about building like better AI, it's about figuring out how to create a better future with AI.
Precisely. And that requires ongoing conversation, research, a commitment to inclusivity and ethical considerations every step of the way.
This deep dive has been, I mean, a real eye-opener for me. It's
Yeah.
clear that this is just the beginning of a much larger conversation about AI and its role in society.
I think so.
And as AI gets more sophisticated, will we become more aware of its biases? Or will those biases become even more ingrained and harder to even detect? It's something to keep in mind as we venture further into this age of intelligent machines.